The parking lot of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, gleamed with the usual government sedans and modest family cars that intelligence officers drove on their bureaucratic salaries, except for one. A burgundy Jaguar sat in a reserved spot belonging to Aldrich Ames, a mid-level CIA officer who earned $60,000 a year, the same officer who had just paid $540,000 cash for a house in Arlington, the same officer whose credit card bills showed $30,000 monthly spending on restaurants, clothing, and luxury goods. In exactly 8 months, the FBI would realize that the worst intelligence disaster in CIA history wasn't a sophisticated KGB operation, but one alcoholic CIA officer who had been selling secrets for nearly a decade while living so lavishly that even his neighbors wondered how he afforded it. This is the story of Aldrich Ames, the CIA mole who betrayed every major American intelligence operation in Russia, got at least 10 agents executed, and did it all while the CIA ignored every warning sign because he was one of them. Aldrich Ames was exactly the kind of CIA officer who should never have had access to classified information. By 1985, his file documented 25 years of mediocre performance, chronic alcoholism, and personal financial problems. His career evaluations described him as barely competent. His colleagues knew him as a drunk who showed up late, left early, and did minimal work. His marriage was falling apart. He was deeply in debt. He had failed the CIA's alcohol rehabilitation program. Any competent security review should have flagged Ames as a severe risk, but the CIA's counterintelligence office, the division responsible for catching moles, had been gutted by budget cuts and bureaucratic infighting. Background checks that should have been updated annually hadn't been conducted in years. Financial monitoring was essentially non-existent. Ames had access to the CIA's most sensitive operations against the Soviet Union, despite being a walking security disaster. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He carried an envelope containing the names of 3 Soviet intelligence officers who were secretly working for the CIA. He handed the envelope to a Soviet guard and asked to speak with a KGB officer. He offered to sell CIA secrets for $50,000. The KGB, initially suspicious this might be an American trap, cautiously accepted. They gave Ames the money and waited to see if the information was genuine. It was. Within weeks, the 3 Soviet officers Ames had betrayed were arrested by the KGB. 2 were executed. The 3rd was imprisoned. The KGB realized they had recruited a source with access to the CIA's entire Soviet operations division. They met with Ames again and offered him a long-term arrangement. $2 million, paid over time, in exchange for everything he could provide about CIA operations in the Soviet Union. Ames accepted immediately. Over the next month, he provided the KGB with the identities of every Soviet citizen who was spying for the United States. More than 20 agents, people who had risked everything to provide intelligence to America, were betrayed by a single CIA officer who wanted money to finance a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The KGB moved quickly. Between May and November 1985, virtually every CIA agent in the Soviet Union was arrested. At least 10 were executed, shot in the basement of Lubyanka prison. Others were imprisoned. A few were turned into double agents, feeding false information back to the CIA. The CIA's intelligence network in the Soviet Union, built over decades at enormous cost, was completely destroyed in 6 months. And the CIA had no idea why. They knew something catastrophic had happened. Agents were disappearing, communications were being ignored, sources were going silent. But they didn't know if it was a mole, a technical compromise of their communications, or simply bad luck. The CIA's counterintelligence office began an investigation to determine what had gone wrong. The investigation would take 9. While the CIA investigated how their Soviet network had been compromised, Aldrich Ames was living like a millionaire. In 1989, he paid $540,000 cash for a house in Arlington, one of Washington's most expensive suburbs. His CIA salary was $60,000 per year. He drove a Jaguar. His credit card bills regularly exceeded $20,000 per month. He wore Italian suits and Rolex watches. He took expensive vacations to Europe with his new wife, a Colombian woman he had married after divorcing his first wife. His colleagues noticed, his neighbors noticed, even his in-laws, visiting from Colombia, wondered how a government bureaucrat could afford such luxury. But somehow the CIA didn't notice. Or more accurately, they noticed but did nothing. CIA security officers were supposed to monitor employees for signs of unexplained wealth. The system had been designed after previous spy cases to catch exactly what Ames was doing. But the monitoring was sporadic and poorly funded. When Ames was finally questioned about his wealth in 1989, during a routine reinvestigation for his security clearance, he told investigators his wife came from a wealthy Colombian family. The investigators, apparently satisfied with this explanation, approved his clearance renewal without verifying anything. They didn't check his financial records. They didn't interview his wife's family in Colombia. They didn't investigate how he was spending far more than his salary. They just accepted his story and moved on. The reality was that Ames's wife came from a middle-class Colombian family with no significant wealth. The money was all from the KGB. Between 1985 and 1993, Ames received approximately $2.7 million from Soviet intelligence. The payments came through various channels designed to avoid detection: cash drops in dead drops around Washington, wire transfers to foreign bank accounts. The KGB even helped Ames create a fake consulting business to explain his income. But the explanations didn't need to be particularly sophisticated because no one was seriously investigating. The CIA's counterintelligence office was aware that Ames had unexplained wealth. They had evidence that he was spending far beyond his means. But they didn't pursue the investigation aggressively because Ames was part of the CIA family. He had worked there for 25 years. His father had been a CIA officer. The institutional culture assumed that CIA officers were loyal. The idea that a trusted insider could betray the agency was psychologically difficult for many CIA officials to accept, so they found reasons to explain away the evidence. Meanwhile, Ames continued betraying operations. Between 1985 and 1993, he compromised more than 100 CIA operations. He revealed the identities of dozens of agents. He told the KGB about technical intelligence gathering methods. He disclosed CIA analysis of Soviet military capabilities. He provided everything he could access, and his access was extensive because his job in the counterintelligence office gave him legitimate reasons to review files on Soviet operations. The breakthrough came in 1991, when CIA counterintelligence officers, led by investigator Jean Vertefeuille, began systematically reviewing everyone who had access to information about the compromised operations. They created a list of CIA officers who could have betrayed the agents. Ames was on the list, but so were dozens of others. Vertefeuille's team began eliminating suspects, one by one, through detailed analysis of who knew what when. By 1992, they had narrowed the list to a handful of suspects. Ames was among them. They began monitoring his financial records and discovered the full extent of his spending. They found the cash house purchase. They found the credit card bills. They found overseas bank accounts. They began surveillance and discovered he was still meeting with Russian intelligence officers. In October 1993, the FBI formally took over the investigation. They placed Ames under intensive surveillance, monitoring his movements, his communications, and his financial transactions. They discovered he was preparing for another meeting with his Russian handlers. On February the 21st, 1994, FBI agents arrested Aldrich Ames as he left his house to drive to work. They arrested his wife simultaneously. Both were charged with espionage. The CIA's worst nightmare was confirmed. The mole who had destroyed their Soviet operations was one of their own officers, someone who had worked in their headquarters for decades while betraying everything he touched. The Ames case forced the CIA to completely overhaul its security procedures. Financial monitoring became mandatory and thorough. Polygraph examinations became more frequent. Access to sensitive information was restricted based on need to know rather than job title. Counterintelligence investigations received more funding and authority. But the real lesson was about organizational culture. The CIA had ignored obvious warning signs because Ames was an insider, someone they had worked with for years. The idea that one of their own could betray them was so uncomfortable that they found ways to rationalize away evidence until it became overwhelming. This same dynamic, trusting insiders despite warning signs, has enabled other intelligence failures before and since the Ames case. Aldrich Ames remains in federal prison, serving his life sentence. He occasionally gives interviews where he continues to minimize his betrayals and claim his actions were justified. The families of the agents he betrayed, many of whom were never publicly identified to protect their relatives still living in Russia, would disagree. The CIA officers who spent years rebuilding the networks he destroyed would disagree. The American taxpayers who funded the intelligence operations he sold to Russia for personal profit would disagree. The case of Aldrich Ames stands as the most damaging intelligence betrayal in CIA history, worse than any KGB operation because it came from within. A reminder that the greatest threats to security often aren't sophisticated foreign operations, but simple human failures, greed, weakness, and institutional blindness to uncomfortable truths. One alcoholic CIA officer with money problems destroyed more American intelligence capability than decades of KGB operations, and he did it while driving a Jaguar that everyone could see, but no one investigated until it was far too late.